All right, we're going to talk about 3 cannons, and well, maybe this audience can understand why those 3 cannons command so much attention. You wouldn't think that 3 cannons should, but these certainly did. And right here, matter of fact, we may even have some people in the room who are in this picture, but there's our reenactors firing off the twin sisters. They're on one side of this monument, and on the other side are the Mexican artillerymen answering that with their single cannon called El Volcán. So let's start off with how these twin sisters were made. We've got some good information from that. This is a picture of a piece of a newspaper from Indianola, Texas in 1854. You might not have thought that such a place like Indianola would have a newspaper, but they did, and here it is. And one of the articles that they had in here says Early Texas History, and it's about a full page actually when you go down to the bottom, and it is a repeat of an article that was written in a Cincinnati newspaper a couple weeks before, and it is written by the 3 men who were responsible for having the twin sisters made in Cincinnati. We'll get into that a little bit more, but it is from this particular newspaper article that we get our best information on where the twin sisters came from. And we'll go through a timeline, and here's where it begins. There was a Texan named Francis Smith who'd been here 3 or 4 years. He was a merchant up at that little village on the Brazos called Tenochtitlan, and he ended up getting sick, and he had to go to Cincinnati for some medical help. And when he got there, he had a friend named Elijah Slack, and as they were lining up his medical help, he and Elijah are talking, and he tells Elijah, I think that Texas is going to have a revolution. I think they're going to split away from Mexico, and we need help. And it turns out that not only Elijah, but 2 or 3 other men in Cincinnati had a big interest in Texas. Not only did they know people here, but some of them owned land here, and it was important that Texas, that land not be taken away from them. So there was a lot of interest. Elijah Slack organized the meeting on November the 17th. They held it. They formed a committee, the Friends of Texas Committee, and they set in motion to make 2 cannons to send to Texas. That was illegal at that point in time in the United States because the United States had a law that said nobody can help a neighbor, and Mexico was our neighbor, and so it was illegal to be making things for use against Mexico. And so they had to kind of hide what they were doing. And in the newspaper, when they announced what they were doing, they called them hollowware. And they didn't put any marks on the cannon whatsoever, so they were kind of secretive about what they were doing. And as a matter of fact, we know that there was a foundry that they were made at. Hawkins and Tatum had a foundry. They made a solid tube, like you see up here, and they had to bore it out for the cannonball to go in. And so the machine shop of Chase and Seymour did that, and a guy named Cassett made the carriages, and we know from this newspaper article that he painted them red with blue wheels. And why that didn't come out in any of the histories, I don't know. You'd think somebody would have mentioned it. I've never seen it mentioned, but it's in the newspaper it happened. There was another guy that made some grape shot for the cannons in Cincinnati. They got delayed for 2 months in Cincinnati because no steamboat captain wanted to take this illegal contraband on their boat. And finally, the captain of the steamboat Splendid decided he'd do it, and so they loaded him up, and in late February they shipped him out of Cincinnati on the Splendid, and on March the 16th they arrived in New Orleans. And they were immediately met by a guy named William Bryan, who was the Texas agent there. He sent a letter back to the governor over here and the general counsel and said, we've got 2 iron field pieces that have just come from Cincinnati, and we're going to forward them to Texas as fast as they can. We know that they arrived in the Brazos River at Brazoria on March the 30th on the schooner Pennsylvania. And we also know that there were two 9-year-old twin girls who were asked to present the cannons to Texas. And Eleanor and Elizabeth Rice did that. And the guy that was in charge of the Texas Army there to receive the cannons was named John Allen. And somebody says, there they are, two twin sisters, the Rice twins and the Cannons. And so the name stuck, and it's attributed to John Allen. They got from Brazoria, they made it down to Galveston on the Pennsylvania. They moved them over to another schooner called the Flash. They sent them in to New Washington or Morgan's Point. They unloaded them, hooked them up to oxen, and sent them off from Harrisburg, or they went to Harrisburg, and then they sent them off from there to head to Gross's plantation, Bernardo Plantation on the Brazos River, which is where Houston and his army were training. Here's a piece of a pension application from Benjamin Breeding, and he just says that I used my father's oxen to pull the twin sisters. He calls them already the twin sisters from near Harrisburg to Houston's army at Gross's. And so that shows who pulled the guns there. Here's one of my favorite. This is an artist's rendition. These guns did arrive at Bernardo Plantation. That's a rendition of what the main plantation house looked like. And so there they are sitting in front of Gross's, where they sat for 2 days before Houston started off this way. So here's where some of the controversy starts off. What were they, 4-pounders or 6-pounders? Were they made out of iron or bronze? If you look at the caliber, there are literally dozens of different accounts by different people who said one thing or another. It's about half 4 and half 6. And I believe that 6 wins on the strength of 3 particular kinds of testimony. One of them was from those 3 men who wrote the newspaper article. They actually signed and testified that what they said was true, and they said they were 6-pounders. And also we have some correspondence between Sam Houston and Thomas Rusk, who was the Secretary of the Army. They're trying to get ammunition for the twin sisters, and they were specifically looking for 6-pound balls. And I think they must have known what kind of cannon they were trying to find ammunition for. And then maybe the most solid evidence of all, if you look in some of the ordnance reports during the Republic of Texas, during the early 1840s, you'll see several official artillery inventories that show these guns, and in each case there are 6-pounders. So I believe 6 wins the caliber battle, and nearly everybody said they were iron. There's not much question about that. There were a few people who said they were brass, really bronze. No brass cannon was ever made, but anyway, we called them brass. But they were really iron guns. And here's a couple of quotes from that newspaper article. There are the 3 guys that were involved. You can see their names and what they did. And in both cases, they said 2 6-pound cannons and 2 6-pound field pieces. So they were 6-pound iron cannons. The reason that people confused them with 4-pounders is because they looked a lot like one. They were called short 6-pounders. They were really smaller than the normal 6-pounder. And the smallest 6-pounder was 6 feet long and weighed about 1,800 pounds. And the typical 4-pounder of the time was also 6 feet long, and it was a little lighter, not much, and it did have a smaller bore. So it's easy to see when you were just looking at a gun how you could say, well, it's a 6-foot-long gun, it must be a 4-pounder. That's wrong. Here's a little detail on John Allen, who gave him the name. He met them there when they arrived on the deal. He sent Sam Houston a letter that says, I've got 2 fine field pieces on March the 31st. And he is the guy who got the Rice twins to make the presentation. And Elizabeth Rice actually wrote in a couple of her things that John Allen, or Captain Allen, named them for myself and my twin sister Elizabeth. The name stuck fast because here is a receipt by John Allen from April the 9th, only 10 days after they arrived in Texas. And he's talking about hiring oxen to send them to Houston's army. And he says, I got 2 yoke of oxen to hire to send the 2 sisters. He didn't call them twin sisters, but he actually called them 2 sisters 10 days after they arrived. And then on July the 22nd, the first really formal evidence we have of the name twin sisters is a letter that the President, David Burnett, wrote Cincinnati thanking them for sending us the guns. All right, that's the twin sisters. Now let's go to the Mexican cannon, the cannons that Santa Anna had. Everybody said it was big. They used the word long to describe it. Most Texans thought it was either 8, 9, or a 12-pounder. They all thought it was really big. And I guess if you were looking across that field at that thing pointed at you, you might have thought so too. But the truth is it was a 6 caliber gun or a 6-pounder. And we know that because the Mexicans left very professional inventories and letters and everything, and they wrote, there must be 5 or 6 different letters where they specifically wrote this was a 6 caliber gun that they had. And so we call it the Golden Standard. I'm going to speak to that in a minute, but its real name was recorded by an eyewitness, and he said on the barrel of the cannon there was an inscription. It said El Volcán, the volcano. So that's the real name of what we call the Golden Standard. And it also had a Latin phrase here on there that meant thunderbolts from the offended king. So we have an eyewitness who left this information for us about that particular cannon. And it turns out that in these archives, in the archives in Mexico City, the Mexican Army archives, we find this plan for a cannon. In Mexico, the Army had made for them 9 6 caliber bronze cannons, made them in Mexico City at the foundry there in 1778. And there's the plan drawing for those cannons. And it shows this Latin inscription, thunderbolts from the offended king, is right there. And it shows a name. Each cannon had an individual name. And this one was El Volcán right here. And they say in this information that this cannon was 6.5 feet long, and an 8 caliber cannon of more modern times is 6.7 feet long. So that's very close, and helps us to understand why a lot of the Texans who saw this thing thought it was bigger than it really was. There's a very good chance, I believe, that the Golden Standard or the El Volcán was this gun right here. It was one of these 9 that was made back in 1778. Part of the reason for believing that is another piece of the archives that came out of Mexico City. This is an inventory made on November the 27th, 1835 in Mexico City, where they inventoried the artillery and the ammunition that they were preparing to take to Texas. And he says it right here. This is a list of the artillery and arms that we're going to send to the operation in Texas. And they list cannons, and they've got regular bronze cannons of 12, 8, and 4 caliber. And then they have a separate category for old or antique cannons, bronze antique cannons of caliber 6. They got 2 of those. And so here in this particular inventory, it shows you that in 1835, they considered the Golden Standard to be an antique cannon at that point in time. And we also have some information from the Chief of Military History at the U.S. Army named John Brown. He did research on this, and he said that the Mexican artillery in the War of 1846, he says, were quite often old and mostly forged in the 1770s. And so if you put those pieces of information together, I believe there's a good chance that the Mexican gun that was used here at San Jacinto was actually made in 1778 in Mexico City. The American name comes from a historian about the turn of the century named Lewis Kemp. He was reading developing some information about people who fought in the battle, and he prints this honorable discharge paper for a soldier named Achille Maury. And he says in here that Maury was one of the 5 men who took the cannon named something from Santa Anna. And here is the something. And I can't read that. And Lewis Kemp thought that it read Golden Standard. I disagree with him. I don't know what that says, but that's the derivation of what the American name for Golden Standard. It's Lewis Kemp's reading of those letters right there. All right, let's go to something that you're probably familiar with. We'll go through this pretty fast. We're going to start on April the 14th. We've got Houston just leaving Bernardo, and he's pulling his twin sisters. And down here at Harrisburg, we've got the Texan government. And over here at Richmond, called Old Fort, we've got Santa Anna, who's just left with his 750 men. So both these two guys leave with their cannons on April the 14th. On April the 16th, they get to Robert's Place. You know the story about the fork in the road. All the army thought Houston was going to retreat. He was going to turn left at that fork. He didn't do it. We can argue why he didn't, but the facts are he didn't. He turned right and headed for Harrisburg. And he got a few miles down the road, and what I think is one of the most fascinating stories of this whole campaign took place. So Houston didn't have much available to pull the cannons from Bernardo. So an innkeeper in San Felipe named Pamelia Mann was there at the camp. She had 2 oxen. She ran a brothel in San Felipe and maybe a few other things, and she was a friend of Houston's. So he asked her, could he use her oxen to pull her cannons? And she said, yes, as long as you're going to Nacogdoches, you can pull them. Houston said, fine. So they hooked them up, and Pamelia's oxen pulled the cannons. They came to Abram Roberts' place, and they turned right, and she said, you're not going to Nacogdoches. And so we've got an account of what happened at that point in time. And so when the army, this is an account. When the army turned right at the fork in the road, Mann demanded that her oxen be returned. One eyewitness said, we got about 10 or 12 miles down the road, and Mrs. Mann overtook us, out on the big prairie wallow and full of water in a very hot day. She rode up to the general and said, General, you told me a damn lie. You said you were going to Nacogdoches Road. Sir, I want my oxen. Well, Mrs. Mann, I can't spare them. We can't get our cannon along without them. Don't care a damn for your cannon. I want my oxen. She had a pair of holster pistols and a very large knife on her saddle. She turned around to the oxen, she jumped down and with the knife cut the rawhide and the chain it was tied with, and nobody said a word. She jumped on her horse with whip in hand, and away she went in the lope with her oxen. It just didn't pay to cross Pamelia. And there she is, pulling the oxen out. And by the way, driving down here a while ago, on 225 out there, we saw this very picture painted on the side of one of the big storage tanks. You can see it from the road. One tough Texas businesswoman. That's a favorite story. All right, a day later, they arrive at White Oak Bayou, probably about where Houston Heights is today. Houston's army did. They spent that night. Santa Anna had already made it to Harrisburg. He sends off some troops down to try to catch the Texan army. They don't quite make it in time. There's still a bigger group back here at Old Fort. April the 18th, Houston makes it to Buffalo Bayou. Santa Anna and his army are down at New Washington, and he knows now, Santa Anna knows they're going to fight, so he'd send a runner back here and said, I need reinforcements, send me 500 men as fast as you can. So those reinforcements leave on April the 18th. On April the 19th, Houston crosses Buffalo Bayou. Santa Anna is still down at New Washington, and General Cose and his 500 soldiers are in a forced march to try to catch up. April the 20th, you know the rest of the story. Houston makes it down to San Jacinto. Later on, about noon or so, Santa Anna makes it up there. Coast is still on his march. And they have mostly a cannon exchangement on April the 20th. There were actually a greater artillery battle on April the 20th than there was the next day on April the 21st. They had a lot of firing at each other back and forth between these cannons on that day. So the day ends, and each of the armies set up their station. Here's a map of the battle. I suspect you're quite familiar with it. The cannons in both armies are kind of in the central part. There's Hockley with the Twin Sisters, and over here on this side is the Golden Standard in some breastworks, and you can see the rest of the San Jacinto battlefield. Here's one of my favorite pictures. Lots of artists have done renditions of this. Here's one I like. The Texans are coming in and the battle is going on. There's the Golden Standard right there. There's Sam Houston behind it. He's kind of like over here in Herman Park. He's on his horse pointing this way. And there's the flag. And there's General Manuel Castrillon. He was probably the best general the Mexican army had. He was highly regarded. He knew what he was doing, and he did not give up. He stayed there and tried to get his men to stick by that cannon and keep firing it, and he failed, and he ended up dying beside the cannon. We have a couple of accounts of what happened in those battles that relate to artillery. So here's a guy named John Wade, and he says when we got to Harrisburg, we made grape and Canada shot for the Twin Sisters with screw nuts and some other small pieces of iron, and we cut up lead bars into pieces about 3/4 of an inch in length and put them into bags for grape shot. Some of them also went into cans for canister. You have heard other accounts where people said they broke up horseshoes. And here's an account that confirms that they were making their own grape shot, so to speak. And in fact, the archaeologists here on this site have found some of these lead pieces. So we know that's a fact. He says on the 21st, talking about now the Texas Army with the Twin Sisters, he said we fired 11 shots on the 21st, 6 from one piece and 5 from the other. The last shot was fired 70 yards from the enemy's works, and then they had to stop shooting because there were so many men up there. They would have hit some of the Texas soldiers as well. Here's another account by a guy named Hunter. He wasn't at the battle. He was back at Harrisburg with the rear guard, but they could hear it. And he says about 3 o'clock in the evening, we heard a cannon fire and another, 3 in succession, and we stopped. And about 2 minutes later, there was another fired. And then the little Twin Sisters commenced. They popped like popcorn in an oven, he said. And those 4 shots were the Golden Standard. And then he talks about the Twin Sisters. And he goes through some more and he says they did, meaning the Mexican army, they did get to fire their cannon, but 3 times. Our men shot them down as fast as they could get to the gun. Our men took their loaded gun, turned it around, and fired one more at them as they were going away, and they give up. So those are the 2 best accounts we have of the use of artillery on April the 21st. Okay, what happened to these guns after the battle? Let's start with the Twin Sisters. We know that one of them went with Thomas Rusk for 2 or 3 months as he shadowed the Mexican army as they withdrew from Texas. And the other one was sent to Galveston Island with all of the other cannons. And we have an inventory of that gun at Fort Travis on June the 1st. We know that the one that went with Rusk was with him when he discovered the remains of the soldiers that were killed in that massacre at Goliad and gathered them up and buried them. And he fired a salute with the other twin sister down in Goliad to commemorate that. We know that both of the twin sisters got back together again, and they arrived at a temporary armory in Houston, which has just been developed or invented on October of 1838. There's an account that says they were both fired in 1839 on Independence Day, March the 2nd. We know that in May 1840 they moved them to Austin. Austin was created in 1839. It needed protection, particularly from the Indians, so the twin sisters went to Austin. There they were fired the next year on the 5th anniversary of this battle. We know that. Secretary of War George Hockley wrote about them being in Austin in 1841. We know that when Houston got elected president, I guess the second time, they were fired in Austin to celebrate that. We know that in 1842, when the Mexicans came back to Texas and actually took San Antonio, they thought that they were going to come to Austin, so they set up the twin sisters at the president's house in Austin to guard the river crossing. We know that's the truth. You get to the Civil War, and we've got a record that they were, on November the 30th, 1863, they were still in Austin in an arsenal, but they were in very poor condition. Rip Ford had been sent to take the Confederate Army and lead them down to the Rio Grande towards the end of the Civil War. These guns were to go with Rip Ford, and we know that in December they were sent to San Antonio, where they got inventoried down there. A few months later, they actually went down halfway to the Rio Grande. They ended up at Corpus Christi, and then they got turned around and came all the way back to San Antonio for a while, and then finally they were sent and arrived at Fort Brown in October of 1864. And they stayed there over the next several months, and then they were used in this last battle of the Civil War at Palmito Ranch in May of 1865. And then the interesting thing is that Ford, they knew the Civil War was over, so he disbanded and all of his men left and went back home. But a Confederate general named James Slaughter was down there at Fort Brown, and he was going to be arrested by the Union Army and didn't want that to happen. So before they got there, he goes into Mexico, takes the cannons with him, and gives them to the Mexican general who's in Matamoros. And he keeps them for about 3 or 4 months and actually used them in the Civil War that was underway in Mexico at that point in time. But when the Union Army showed up at Fort Brown, they knew what had happened to these cannons, so they sent word over to the Mexican general and said, "We want them back," and he gave them back. And so we know that on July the 9th of 1835, the twin sisters were back at Fort Brown, and that's the last we know of them. Most likely, with no confirmation, most likely they were shipped back with dozens of other excess cannons, shipped back east somewhere, and probably got melted down and turned into a cast iron cook stove in some foundry back east. All right, let's talk about about Santa Anna's cannon. What happened to the Golden Standard? We know also that it was right after the battle, it was moved to Galveston, and it was in that inventory that we mentioned on June the 1st. And then we're pretty sure, not positive, but pretty sure that it was mounted on a Texas warship called the Independence in late 1836. And we also know for a fact that the Independence got in a fight with some Mexican ships and lost, was captured on April 17th, 1837 at Velasco, just at the mouth of the Brazos River. And that gun, that El Volcán, the Golden Standard, was on that ship, and it was captured by the Mexicans, and they recognized it, and they were quite proud of the fact that they had recaptured it. In fact, it even appeared in a newspaper in Mexico City on May the 11th. And here's the full account, but it says, among the cannons mounted on the Independence, there's one of 8 caliber, lost a year ago in San Jacinto, and it has the names of the principal ladies of Texas, where the said cannon is considered to be one of the best trophies granted to them by whimsical fortune. And so there are 2 things here that are of interest. One is it was a fact that women groups would often raise money to help with the war effort. And so it would have not been uncommon for a group of Texas ladies to raise some money to help mount this gun on the Independence. That may be the derivation of this business about the Texas women. And the fact that it's mentioned as an 8 caliber here suggests that it was probably, when they mounted it, they did so in New Orleans, they probably bored it out to an 8-pounder, and so by the time it got captured, in this case it was the Golden Standard, which they knew by the name, and it was an 8-pounder at that point in time. Okay, there are some other cannons that a lot of people thought were the twin sisters, but were not. And I call them the imposters. So let me talk about the imposters. 2 iron and 2 bronze. I'll dismiss one of them pretty quickly. There were 2 bronze 6-pounders that Thomas Jefferson Greene got for Texas. They arrived at Velasco in late May of 1836 after the battle, and there's a few people who thought they were the twin sisters, and they weren't. The interesting story really are with these ones that are in red. And let me start at the top. On a ship named the Cayuga were 2 iron 4-pounders. I'm going to detail that more in a minute. And then there were 2 iron guns that Thomas Jefferson Chambers got for Texas. They were also iron 6-pounders, and they ended up in Louisiana. We'll see that in a minute. And then probably the most interesting one for us here in the Houston area, there were some 2 bronze 6-pounders that were given to the Houston Artillery Company. This is not a military organization. It's a volunteer, mostly a social group. They call themselves the Artillery Company. Galveston had one, Houston had one, and each one of those 2 groups were rivals socially, and they both wanted to be the ones who had the real twin sisters. So they each concocted a story to say that they had. All right, let's look. Here's the Cayuga twins. They were 4-pounders. They were on this steamboat Cayuga. Right after the battle, they went up. They took the president and some other people were the first to arrive after the battle outside here, and they fired these guns in salute of the victory. At that point in time, they went back to Galveston, and they were just building Fort Travis, which is the first fort on Galveston. So they unload these 2 4-pounders and 4 4-pounders from other ships, and those 6 4-pounders became the first guns that were mounted in Fort Travis. They were small, and they didn't stay very long because they soon got some bigger guns and replaced them, and they threw the 2 Cayuga twins in the mud, and they stayed there for a couple of years. A big hurricane came in 1842 and pretty much destroyed Fort Travis. So they were going through resurrecting that. The Galveston Artillery Company was helping the Texas Army do that, and they find the 2 Cayuga twins, and they were refurbished in Houston and given to the Galveston Artillery Company. And we have information that says that probably at that point in time, somebody, the Galveston Artillery Company, made a plaque of silver that said Twin Sisters and nailed it on the carriage of those Cayuga twin cannons. And they called them the Twin Sisters from there on, and that got a lot of people confused. We do know that in 1860, they were bored out to be 6-pounders in preparation for the Civil War. We know that in 1864, they were sent to Austin and San Antonio, and then they ended up going back to Houston, which is where they ended the war. And again, like most of the others, they were most likely sent to Galveston and shipped back east for metal recycling. So this is probably one of the 2 most famous imposters that we have for the Twin Sisters. Here is the blacksmith's invoice for repairing those 2 guns that they had dug up in the mud in Fort Travis. And he very clearly shows that they're 4-pounders, which they were, and he called them the Twin Sisters, which they were not. Probably because he was the one who put the little plaque on there that said Twin Sisters. That's a speculation. Okay, here's the other 2 pair of imposters. And we're pretty sure this is all accurate. Chambers bought them. They arrived in Texas in late 1836. We do know that they stayed around here, but as soon as Texas became a state, we ceded all of our artillery to the United States, and there were too many cannons. Some of them were sent to New Orleans, and 2 of these Chambers cannons were sent to New Orleans and ended up in a foundry junkyard over there for a few years. As the Civil War was about to get underway, everybody could see it coming, and even before it started, we started to prepare. So we remembered that what somebody thought was the twin sisters were sent to New Orleans, so we asked Louisiana, would you find them and give them back? And they said, we sure will. So they found them, they got them refurbished, they put a plaque on each one of them that says, this gun was used in terrible effect at the Battle of San Jacinto, presented to Texas by Louisiana, 1861. They were delivered to Galveston on April the 16th, 61. They were used in the Civil War. After the Civil War, there was a guy from Ohio, a Union soldier from Ohio who was in Houston, and he saw them laying on the ground in Houston. And he wrote he even actually drew a picture of this carriage plaque and made some notes very specifically what cannons he saw. And there is no question that he saw one of these guns because he shows the plaque that's got those exact words on it. Anyway, they were shipped east to Houston like the rest of them and lost for a while. But in 1924, the old antique roadstore story, somebody bought an old armoire and opened a drawer, and there's one of those bronze carriage plaques in there that has got this on it. And so they sent it back to Texas, and it's in a museum at Baylor today. This plaque is, and so we know pretty sure that one of these imposters ended up, or both of them ended up in New York, and we've got the carriage plaque on one of them. Here's the one that's probably the most interesting, and that's the guns that were given to the Houston Artillery. They got them in 1840. Texas bought 6 guns, and they gave 2 of them to the Houston Artillery Company. And they again were competing with Galveston, and there are at least 2 independent accounts that say that these bronze guns had an inscription stamped on the barrel, and the inscription said, presented to the Republic of Texas by the ladies of Cincinnati. Mostly true, but it looks like that the Houston Artillery had that stamped on there so they could claim they had the twin sisters because they were competing with the Galveston group, which had the Cayuga twins, the other imposters. Anyway, during the 1850s, they were fired from several celebrations. They were touted to be the twin sisters. People saw them, they wrote about them, they knew they were twin sisters. They knew they were bronze 6-pounders, which they were. Here's the story about this guy named Graves, who was a Confederate soldier, got pardoned at Galveston, got off the train at Harrisburg, and he sees these 2 cannons that somehow he recognized as the twin sisters. He said they had an inscription on the barrel, said they were the twin sisters, and he wasn't about to have the Union Army get a hold of our famous cannons, so he and some buddies buried them somewhere near Harrisburg, thinking they had buried the twin sisters. There have been a lot of people looking for those guns ever since, and they haven't found them yet. And the reason that they haven't is because they aren't there anymore. Again, from this old archives, we've got this little blurb in an 1865, September the 1st, Houston newspaper, and it says, 2 brass cannons were found yesterday, buried about 3 miles from this city. I can't tell you for sure that those were the Houston Artillery guns, but I sure think they were. I think that pretty much confirms that they were bronze cannons, and they were the ones from the Houston Artillery Company. All right, and that ends it. This is my book that's got all this stuff in it we talked about. And let me just say thank you for your attention. I hope it's been of interest to you, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have.